the Emax TinyHawk 2, which is the follow-up to the previous TinyHawk S, which as you can see I have here. So real quick, just what comes with the TinyHawk is pretty standard for Emax. We have this nice little zipped carrying case that has a spot for the quad, and since it is ducted, it fits in there with the props on, which is very nice. We have our USB charger that lets you charge the 1 or 2S battery, a couple spare screws, and a little screwdriver there. We do get a set of spare props, an instruction manual, and a warning for the 2S. Now that warning just states that when you're flying it on 2S, you need to go and change the PID and rate profile from 1 to 2. 1 represents 1S, 2 represents 2S. And then of course we do get our two batteries, the 1S 450 mAh and the 2S 300 mAh. Now if we take a look at the TinyHawk 2 compared to the TinyHawk S, you can right away see some differences. In terms of the frame, obviously now they've gone to sort of a white shell, and if you look, there are some minor differences, same amount of spokes, but if you see these are just singles here, they have gone ahead and beefed up the frame. It is said to be more durable now. As well as moving to the camera, this is probably the biggest and most impactful change. Before, we're just using a very small nano camera that, isn't too great on the quality, but now they've swapped to the RunCam Nano 2. You can see back in there, it actually is a legit RunCam, which is very, very nice. It is a high-performing nano camera, which will let you see a lot better. I was very happy that they went with this instead of the RCAddict offerings they normally go with. And then as you can see also on this one, there's no antenna sticking up. Everything's pretty much routed internally, which can lead to quite poor signal. However, on this one, they have both antennas right away, the receiver antenna for FreeSky and the VTX antenna popping straight out. And this new VTX does 200 milliwatts, so you can fly and get much better range with this guy. Just one thing that is interesting on the TinyHawk S, you can see the motors are plugged in the back there, and on this board here, it has the plugs, they're mounted this way, however, they're not being used, the motors are actually soldered on. That is because of the new LEDs. You can see these LED strips they've added here. These function in the same way race lights do, if you're not familiar with those. Basically, they work off of the motor signals, so the more power you pull through the motors, the stronger the LEDs get. And since we now have a white thin plastic frame, it does definitely light up a little bit, as long as you're not in completely bright sunlight. Indoors is actually a quite cool effect flying around. You see the little lights up all the way around red. Unfortunately, you cannot change these colors, and I don't think they offer any different color strips, so you're stuck with red. In terms of the motors, they've changed to the same 0802, but now they've gone to a 16,000 kV motor instead of the previous 15.5K. So let's just go ahead and get into some flight footage. I'll put it up in the top right as usual. And right away, hopefully you notice that the camera, the RunCam 2, is doing a much better job. If you're familiar with very small cameras, it looks very, very nice. So flying around with this guy was no problem, especially in darker, like extremely bright and dark contrast outside in the sun. This was in the Bahamas where I filmed this. Everything looked really good and really nice colors outside. This first clip that was on 1S, the little 1S 450, and I found pretty decent flight times on this. However, this quad is definitely a little bit heavier than previous ones, and we'll weigh it in just a bit. The 1S performance is definitely very tame. It's nothing special at all, since it is the heaviest iteration of this quad. However, I think it still is a good option for beginners. I recommended the TinyHawk S on 1S for beginners, and I'm not sure if this is better. It's less powerful on 1S because of the weight, and it's more sedate to fly, which is definitely good for a beginner. I'm not sure where the point is where it gets too weak, but you could definitely still fly this around pretty well, and having the nicer VTX and camera is awesome. In terms of the VTX, you do need to press and hold the button when you power it on to unlock it. There are some channels locked. They go over that in the menu. And of course, it works with smart audio through the Betaflight OSD. Now here, switching it up to 2S, we take this guy outdoors, and just like the previous TinyHawk, this thing is pretty insane on 2S. Now, as I mentioned, it is heavier, so the performance was not quite as good, and of course your motors are going to get very hot and your battery is not going to like it at all if you're just blasting this guy around on 2S, and you'll get very, very short flight times. So I would recommend, if you're going to fly harder on 2S, to maybe implement an 80% throttle cap. So overall, the flying experience on 2S for the TinyHawk 2 wasn't as crazy as it was before. It's definitely still very powerful for a quad of this size, and it's definitely very locked in. Obviously, the flight time is lacking since you're pushing it this hard, which is why I'm not completely sure if this TinyHawk 2 model is the one that you're going to want to get if you want to go crazy or maybe do some micro racing with. I still think the TinyHawk S might be a better option because it's lighter and you can deal with the camera. It's not as nice to look at, definitely, and the VTX is definitely weaker. However, when you're racing, 25 milliwatts is usually the limit, so the lighter TinyHawk S is probably a better option. And just real quick, a note about the turtle mode on this, which is flipping it, if you're upside down, flipping it back over. It does work on 1S, but I only got it to work once. It is definitely really hard to turtle on 1S with this, which is disappointing, but you know, it's kind of expected with these extremely small props. On 2S, it works pretty much most of the time. So now let's go ahead and get a weight for it. So the TinyHawk 2 without the battery weighs 31.1 grams, and then TinyHawk S, the previous version, weighs 27 grams. So it's 4 grams lighter, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. Now this video isn't going to be too long because there's not too much extra to say about the TinyHawk 2. We're just going over the changes and obviously showing the flight footage from the new VTX and camera, and the DVR was recorded on my Sky Zones. But I do want to say, if you're looking for a quad in a similar size to this, that I would still take a look at the Emax TinyHawk Freestyle, which I have here. This is definitely sort of a different class of quad. These two, obviously with their 1S capabilities and their prop guards, are meant for more indoor flying, whereas the TinyHawk Freestyle uses larger 2.5-inch props. Obviously, I don't have them on right now, but you get a much nicer flying experience for outside since it can handle wind and it has more power, as well as you get extremely long flight times on this guy, like 6 to 8 minutes, which is very, very nice. Obviously, some of the drawbacks of this one is the weaker VTX here, as well as the smaller, lower quality camera, but I didn't find it to be too big of an issue when I was testing this. So if you're looking for an indoor quad, I would choose between these two, and specifically outdoors, I still prefer the TinyHawk Freestyle, definitely. And here's some footage from a recent micro indoor race where I actually used the TinyHawk 2 and I ended up coming out with the win. Now here it is indoors on a very small track, more suitable towards a brushed whoop, but this was all I had, so I was using this. And I was flying on 2S, however I had to make some throttle curve adjustments and run it at a 60% throttle cap, since obviously there was not very much room to open it up in here. But keeping the line smooth and the speed consistent overall, I was able to take the win and it performed very well. So yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for the video on the Emax TinyHawk 2. And now would I choose it versus the previous TinyHawk S? I think that depends on what you're doing. If you're just going for all-out crazy flying, highest performance, the TinyHawk S is still better in my opinion. But if you're just more of a casual flyer and you just want to kind of fly around, and this thing definitely still performs really well. It's just, since it's heavier, it's not quite as good as the previous one. But now you have the nicer camera and the nicer VTX. I think this will be a better experience all around for the average flyer. So there'll be links in the description to all three of these down below if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.